All right. Perfect. Welcome back, everybody. I hope most of you had a good lunch or a good dinner or snack. We're going to press on with the last session of the day, which is not the least, I would say, because there's a lot of exciting talk. So just a quick overview. We'll have a first talk by Dr. Kimberly Stachenfeld, who's with us right now, followed by a talk by Dr. Puya Bashivan, then a talk by Dr. Guillaume Dumas, and then finally the last keynote of our conference from Dr. Daniel Bassett. So we will kick off this session with a talk from Kimberly Stachenfeld. Just by ways of a quick introduction, so Kim, for short, if I'm not mistaken, is a neuroscientist that works at DeepMind with a background in quantitative and computational neuroscience, and as well as machine learning. Her main research focus is on representations to support efficient reinforcement learning and planning. She's taking her groundbreaking neuroscience work and using it to better understand artificial intelligence. Her research interests include hippocampus, entorhinal cortex, reinforcement learning, efficient representations for reinforcement learning, and on good days, fMRI. All right, so without further ado, I think Kim is going to talk to us about representation learning in the hippocampal-entorhinal circuit. And with that, the floor is yours. If you just share your screen, we'll be on our way here. Yeah.
Thank you. Can you see my screen?
Not yet.
Oh, that's not great. Not anything now?
Not exactly.
Oh, that's weird. It worked in the practice. I'm so sorry.
No problem.
Is there something I should press that I may not have pressed? Oh, there it is. I see.
Here we go.
Ah, sorry. Okay.
That's fine. Here we go. Perfect.
There you go. Okay, great.
Okay, so now we see beautiful canyon. All right, we're in business now.
Great.
Okay.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks for your patience. And thank you for that wonderful introduction. As mentioned, my research is at the interface of neuroscience and machine learning. I'm going to talk today about an assortment of problems that involve structure learning and geometric representations. And I'll talk a little bit about the role that hippocampus and entorhinal cortex plays in these problems. So first, we have early evidence that animals learn structure about the environment, even when it's not immediately rewarded, from Tolman's early experiments with rodents in mazes. Oops. There we go. Okay. You may, yeah, so this might look familiar to you from James Whittington's introductory sections. We have pretty highly overlapping introductory sections as a small warning. Tolman is primarily famous for introducing the term cognitive map, and that captures this idea that animals represent relationships and contingencies in the environment in a way that they can reason about and iterate over these representations to ultimately produce sophisticated behavior. So this cognitive map idea became sort of the key metaphor neuroscientists had for thinking about how structure could be represented in the animal brain. A few decades later, it turned out that this cognitive map idea had a pretty literal neural correlate in the hippocampus. So O'Keefe and Ostrovsky found these cells called place cells, and they're in the hippocampus, and they fire whenever the animal is in a particular location in space. So these black lines in the bottom right plot mark the trajectory of an animal as it travels around a square enclosure, and these green dots show wherever a place cell fired. The histogram on the left shows that indeed this firing is localized in space. A few decades later than that, grid cells were discovered in a nearby region of the brain called entorhinal cortex. And grid cells also have spatially receptive cells. However, instead of having primarily one region of activity, they have multiple regions of activity that are arranged in this hexagonal grid pattern. And so whereas place cells have for a long time been hypothesized to represent individual locations with some degree of specificity, grid cells are thought of as representing the underlying metric structure of space, the regularity of space. And this is primarily because they repeat in this regular way across space. So these cells were a pretty big deal. The neuroscientists who reported on them recently won the Nobel Prize. They also have largely been responsible for launching this investigation into many other aspects of how physical space is represented in the brain. And it turns out there's many other types of cells too that represent head direction, boundaries, landmarks, obstacles in the environment. We now have this very rich picture of how physical space is represented in the brain, particularly the rodent brain. However, we're starting to see now that these cells are not just for physical space. So in this task where animals hear a rising pitch and have to release a lever at a target pitch, hippocampal cells will represent the pitch of a sound. In this really surreal task where humans were shown morphing birds with 2 dimensions of variation, their leg and neck length, we see grid-like representations that tile this leg times neck space as measured with fMRI. And when monkeys look at images or mice navigate in virtual reality, we also see these grid-like representations in entorhinal cortex. So this is interesting because none of these tasks are spatial navigation per se, but they in a way resemble navigation. They have this common underlying linear or planar Euclidean structure. It gets even more interesting because it turns out that hippocampus is not just for physical space and not just for these tasks that share this underlying Euclidean structure, but also for problems that are better represented as discrete task spaces, where a mathematical object like a graph or a Markov decision process might be more apt a description. In these tasks, we see hippocampus encoding something that looks like a discrete state index. So this is consistent with these ideas about hippocampus perhaps representing relations between states or representing a model of transitions in the environment, how you might transition between states. And in both of these cases, physical locations in space and the relations that join them would just be one special case. So from a normative perspective, I find this view really exciting. Graphs and transition models are extremely flexible general objects that are suited to modeling a very large suite of problems. Hippocampus seems to have some role in encoding these problems, and you can imagine why it might be useful for an animal to be able to represent these very general and arbitrary associations between things it might encounter. On the other hand, I think it can feel a little bit like these models are throwing a lot away. Physical space comes with this deep regularity and these symmetries that make generalization and transfer possible. And it seems like there's dedicated cell types in the brain that encode these regularities, and these give us a lot of generalization power. Navigating from point A to point B in one section of space has something in common with navigating from point C to point D in another section. Vectors kind of have this common structure. So we want to try and think about how we can get this generalizability that geometry in 2D space gets us to this more general suite of tasks that are represented with relational models like graphs or MDPs. So for this, we're going to take this perspective of what representation we want that can support a general suite of reinforcement learning problems. We're going to take this representation learning perspective. So we'll motivate this from 2 key questions about what we want in a representation. The first is, what structure should we learn besides reward? Many RL agents will only learn about information that's immediately related to predicting your reward, but this ends up throwing a lot away. The other question is how we can make this information generalized in the way that metric representations of space permit this good generalization. So one answer to the first question of what structure we should learn to capture a lot of information about the environment is predictions. And many models use predicting upcoming state as an intermediate objective in reinforcement learning problems. And some of these are listed here. One answer to the second question of how we can make it generalized is to utilize some form of compression, where we want to learn as short a description as possible of our states and which states they predict, so that when we learn about one state, we automatically learn about all of the other states that predict something similar. So this has something in common with this idea that that space has this deep regularity to it. We want to try and extract other regularities like this and apply them in this more diverse set of problems. So we had this paper in 2017 hypothesizing that we could think about place cells and grid cells in this context, where place cells are trying to predict what's going to happen next, and grid cells are trying to compress this information in the form of a low-dimensional map. In the intervening time, we've worked on extensions to both of these models, both the predictive place cell aspect and the compression grid cell aspect. I'm going to talk mostly about the grid cell extensions today, but if you're interested in some of the predictive model extensions, I recommend Jesse Gerritz's work on probabilistic successor representations that I was fortunate enough to collaborate on. So the way we're going to think about compression in this context is using dimensionality reduction. So we're going to start with this matrix here, which captures predictions about the environment. And the way it does this is each entry in this matrix captures the expected number of visits to state J, given some starting state I. So the rows are I and the columns are J. We can call this matrix the successor representation matrix. And we can compute its eigendecomposition, which expresses M as the product of eigenvectors, a diagonal matrix of eigenvalues, and the eigenvector matrix, again, this time transposed. And if we keep 6 of the eigenvectors as shown here, then we can reconstruct this matrix M while losing a little bit of information. So if we kept more than 6 eigenvectors, we would have a more precise reconstruction. In this case, we capture the general structure of M. You can see these look kind of similar to each other, but we lose some of the precision. The diagonal is a little bit less sharp. And as we keep fewer and fewer eigenvectors, the information represented gets coarser and coarser, and more is lost. And I should add that the environment for which we're making predictions in this context is this discretized linear track shown in the bottom right-hand corner, where we're pretending we just have a mouse wandering around in this abstract virtual discretized track. So this is the model that we used to represent grid cells. And this came partly out of the observation that these eigenvectors tend to look very grid-like, particularly if you look at the higher frequency eigenvectors. They have these regular, periodic, repeating patterns to them, which resemble grid fields. Because these eigenvectors are anchored to the transition structure or the predictive structure rather than spatial coordinates per se, they also allow us to make hypotheses about what will happen in certain environments where the regular structure of space is interrupted. So for instance, if you look at grid fields in irregular geometric environments, you get changes and distortions to the grid field pattern, which we can capture. We can also capture the way grid fields fragment in a hairpin maze, and the way grid fields change as the animal explores a multi-compartment environment. So broadly speaking, what this model is able to capture is how interruptions to the transition structure are known to affect the shape of grid cells. And another benefit of this model is that because it's anchored to this relationally specified terms, because it's based on transitions and the graph structure, we can form hypotheses for non-Euclidean geometric environments, environments that don't necessarily have the regularity that physical space has. I also recommend some of these other approaches to which our model is related. James Whittington presented his yesterday, I believe. What these models tend to have in common is that they motivate grid fields as emerging from the transition statistics of space, rather than saying that they're necessarily a product of physical space themselves. So one thing that these eigenvectors are really good at doing, and the way in which they're involved in compression, is that they can expose the structure we see in different types of graph-described environments. So for instance, if we have a graph with clusters or with community structure, these eigenvectors will expose the clusters. These are also used for spectral clustering methods. If we have graphs that are constrained to lie on a low-dimensional manifold, the first few eigenvectors will vary across this manifold. That's how it can help expose the low-dimensional structure of physical space. And if we have automorphisms or self-symmetries in the environment, we'll get multiple eigenvectors with the same eigenvalue that span different axes. So this tells us a little bit about how space can relate to itself. We can also use these eigenvectors to organize information by timescale. And they're useful for capturing multiscale information. So each of these rows is a different environment described by a graph. As you go from left to right, we're decreasing the eigenvalue. And you can see that the frequency of information, the scale at which information varies across this graph, gets higher and higher as we decrease the eigenvalue. And exactly how that manifests depends on the structure of the environment. Fine spatial scales look different in different environments, but they have this property in common that as you include more and more eigenvectors in your reconstruction, you have finer precision, and they're changing at faster spatial scales. So we can map this onto how we think about multiple spatial scales in the brain. And multiple spatial scales have a pretty clear anatomical correlate in hippocampus and entorhinal cortex. If you record a place cell from the top dorsal section of hippocampus, it tends to have a very small place field that's shown on the bottom left here, these small dorsal fields. As you record more and more ventrally, that is, you get lower and lower in the brain, place fields get larger and larger gradually. And you have a similar trend in entorhinal cortex as well, where the ventral fields have a very fine spatial scale and a lot of precision, and the more ventral ones have much more coarse and large scales represented. However, in entorhinal cortex, rather than having this continuum of scales, you get a more like quantized modular distribution along the axis. So we can map this onto the way we think about eigenvectors and place cells with different levels of resolution relating to each other. So let's say we're going to simulate a place cell that has a high degree of precision. We're going to pretend it's a dorsal place cell from the very dorsalmost section of hippocampus. If we're going to try and reconstruct this by weighting all of the different eigenvectors that can be combined to create it, then we're going to need to use a lot of the eigenvectors. Each one of these will have a non-zero weight because we need them to produce the full degree of precision we see in this fine-grained map. As we get a coarser and coarser representation, we need fewer and fewer eigenvectors in order to reconstruct it. So this process of reweighting eigenvectors in order to create maps with different levels of resolution can be described as spectral modulation. We're basically just changing the multiplicative gain on each of these eigenvectors in order to produce a map that has a different spatial scale. This is useful if we want to either dynamically modulate the scale that we care about. We can do that easily by just changing the filter over these eigenvectors. Or if we want to simultaneously reason about multiple different scales, we can do that in different sections of hippocampus that connect differently to different grid cell populations. And I should say that there is also connectivity between entorhinal cortex and hippocampus that captures this trend, where you see the more dorsal cells having a connective weight with a full range of entorhinal cortex, whereas the more ventral sections of hippocampus draw primarily from the ventral sections of entorhinal cortex. So in addition to supporting place maps that have different scales associated with them, we can use spectral modulation to create samplers that have different scales as well. So here we're reweighting the eigenvectors to produce some distribution over the environment and then sampling from that environment. Whereas before we reweighted eigenvectors to create place cells that look different, now we're creating distributions that look different. So for instance, these two red lines correspond to different weights on the eigenvectors that produce random walks that have different widths associated with them. So the thick red line has a larger step size associated with the random walk. We can also use spectral modulation to change not only the scale of our samplers, where we're sampling more locally or more broadly, but also the shape. So a slightly different pattern of spectral modulation will allow us to produce Lévy flights rather than random walks. And this is work that's done primarily by Dan McNamee, who's a postdoc at UCL. I was lucky enough to collaborate on this, as well as Matt Botvinnik and Sam Gershman. These Lévy flights that are produced with spectral modulation have this property where they have a more heavy-tailed distribution of step sizes. So that means that if you're using this pattern to sample from your environment, you tend to take a random walk in this local area, but this random walk is punctuated by occasional very large jumps to new regions of space. So you get like diffusion plus occasional gigantic jumps. This pattern of sampling from an environment is actually observed across many different species and examples of animal foraging. So if you look at albatrosses searching for prey, foraging spider monkeys, even humans who are just looking at an image, these Lévy flights are observed. This is something that Sam Gershman noticed, is that what we had been calling super diffusion is actually this Lévy flight pattern, which is really common. And it's hypothesized to be so common because it results in better coverage time than random walks do. Random walks tend to dither. They tend to spend too much time in the same location, and these large jumps help stop that. This is especially useful in compartmentalized environments. So if we use a random walk to explore this 4 rooms environment, the animal or agent tends to get stuck in one room because transitions through these doorways are relatively rare. However, if we're using this spectrally defined Lévy flight, then we occasionally take a large jump and get out of the room. And so we don't spend quite as much time stuck in the same room. And it's important that we're using spectral modulation to define these Lévy flights because it means that we have a version of big jump that is anchored to the actual environmental structure of this environment. We're not going to try and take a big jump straight into a wall or a boundary of the environment. Our big jumps will automatically propel ourselves through doorways because they're anchored to the structure of the environment. So one thing Dan noticed that we could use this model to do is to explain different sampling modes that are observed in animals in different states. So if this is data that is recorded from rats by Stella et al. And what was found is that if you have an animal foraging in an open environment, its pattern of foraging, its behavior looks like a Lévy flight. And this is consistent with what foraging looks like across many species, as we showed. However, if you record hippocampal activity from the animal while it's asleep, you end up getting what's called replay. You get activity in hippocampus that looks similar to what the animal was playing during the day. So you have representations of different locations in space in hippocampus, and you see those same locations replayed in the asleep animal. However, in this asleep version of the activity, the hippocampal replay looks more like random walks than it does like a Lévy flight. And this is interesting for 2 reasons. One is that it says that during sleep, the hippocampus is not just recapitulating what its experience was through the day. It's not just sampling random memories through the day and replaying them, because it's sampling from its model using different statistics. If it was just recapitulating what it saw, you'd still see Lévy flight-like behavior. It's also interesting because it suggests that the circuitry in hippocampus allows you to both represent these super diffusive or Lévy flights, but also this random walk behavior, which is something that spectral modulation can permit. Another type of spectral modulation we can produce and relate to brain data is this idea of minimally autocorrelated samples. So basically, there is a way to reweight these eigenvectors such that when we sample from the resulting distribution, the samples will be minimally overlapping with each other. And this is useful for describing the type of activity we see in the rodent brain as it approaches a decision point. So Kay et al. Reported that as the animal runs down the central arm of this M maze and approaches a decision point where it has to go either left or right, you see this cycling of activity between the different possible futures. And this can be well explained by using this minimally autocorrelated mode of sampling, because in order to get minimal autocorrelations, these different opposite outcomes from each other won't overlap very much. So we were excited to see in these simulations that spectral modulation can capture all of these different types of sampling that we actually do observe in hippocampus. However, we were also wondering why we see these different sampling modes and thought maybe this would tell us why spectral modulation might be useful in this context. So for Lévy flights, as we mentioned earlier, they're really useful for maximizing the efficiency of exploration. This blue line at the top is Lévy flights. And you can see that they have much better coverage time in this toy clustered environment we have. However, if your goal is to consolidate a representation of the environment that captures the structural elements really well, we find Lévy walks aren't quite as good at this as a random walk is. If you are training a model to try to capture the statistics of what you've observed, then replaying the Lévy flight that you may have experienced is not as good as emphasizing these structural elements as a random walk is. And you can see that this model here that is trained on a random walk has more of this block diagonal structure to it and captures the clusters a little bit better. And finally, the minimum autocorrelation model really excels when we're talking about planning, because this is the model that maximizes coverage of the environment when you're not subject to the constraint that you actually have to walk between these locations. If you're just imagining different locations, this minimal autocorrelated model will help you explore as much of the environment as possible. Sorry, I just got a question, Lévy flights or Lévy walks? I mean Lévy flights, and I keep accidentally saying Lévy walks because I'm also talking about random walks. But that's a great question, and I apologize for the confusion. Let's see if there's other questions. These are interesting questions. I'll get to them at the very end, so I have enough time. But okay, so the final area of machine learning I want to talk about here is this topic of relational deep learning. And this is another area where we want to think about how the intrinsic geometry of a problem can be leveraged in order to make our reasoning better. So relational deep learning considers how to apply neural networks to relationally specified data. So one example of this is molecules. This is a really big area where each node in the graph is an atom and bonds specify the connectivity. A number of physical processes, such as B, C, and D in this little plot, also can be represented as relational problems where you're considering how different objects in your scene relate to each other. Some more abstract problems like linguistics with sentences and parse trees, and also question answering about how objects in a scene relate to each other can also all be considered relational problems. So broadly within the area of relational deep learning, there are two main approaches for thinking about how to apply neural networks to relationally structured data. So the first on the left is the spatial approach. And the spatial approach involves learning filters, which correspond to neural networks over your immediate neighbors. So basically, in this most basic variant, you take all your neighboring nodes, you pass their features through a neural network, you sum the outputs, and you update the current node's features accordingly. So you keep applying this iteratively, and it propagates information across the graph in what's sometimes referred to as message passing. In this spectral approach, you project the node features of your input graph onto the eigenvectors that we described earlier, and then we pass this through a neural network. So you're basically learning filters over the spectral domain graph signal. You're learning them over this projected signal directly. These approaches are generally associated with different trade-offs. The spatial approach is broadly considered more flexible and expressive because of the way high-level features are built up incrementally from low-level features. Each time you do message passing, you introduce a level of sophistication that can be used to ultimately produce really complex high-level features. However, the spectral approach is sometimes considered more global. And what I mean by that is that it has an easier time accessing signals that vary across the entire graph. In the spatial approach, these entire graph signals need to be built up gradually in successive rounds of message passing. And this can sometimes corrupt the signal or lose information that's better captured by representing the global components immediately from the input. So there's a couple different works that I listed that review these approaches and show good examples of them. I'm sure it's not comprehensive, but these are really great reviews and I highly recommend them. So one thing that we've been working on is trying to combine these approaches in order to strike some sort of favorable balance between their trade-offs. So we're going to start out with a spatial GraphNet, which performs message passing as specified over the edges of the inputted graph. And on each round of message passing, we're going to produce a new graph with updated node features, and that's what this illustrates here. We're going to augment this graph with what we call a spectral graph. And this is a complete or fully connected graph in which each node corresponds to one of the first k eigenvectors of the graph. So we're representing these as just an unordered set of eigenvectors that are all connected to each other. And we're also going to initialize the features of this spectral graph using the eigenvalues of the corresponding eigenvector. So message passing is going to occur over both of these graphs in parallel, which lets us do computations in the spectral domain and some in the original or spatial domain. On each round of message passing, we're going to send information from the spatial domain to the spectral domain using what we're calling eigenpooling. Basically, we're going to project the node features onto the first few eigenvectors by multiplying the spatial node features by each eigenvector and summing them. And then we'll do the inverse mapping to send information back from the spectral graph to the spatial graph. And this we'll call eigenbroadcasting because we're sending things back to the spatial representation from the spectral one. And this is a slightly complicated architecture. I realize I built it up slowly, but like there's still a lot of bells and whistles in it. But hopefully from the way it's illustrated, it exposes the fact that we can think of this as a somewhat hierarchical model, where the high level graph is constructed from the coarse-grained, low-frequency first few eigenvectors information, and this low-level graph is the original inputted graph. So it's doing a version of pooling and broadcasting that we'd see in a hierarchical model and using these eigenvectors in order to do this mapping. So I'll go briefly over some of our results. We tried this on a couple different data sets. One was GraphMNIST, where we constructed graphs from images and randomly dropped out certain nodes in order to introduce some variety. We also used a molecular property prediction task where we're trying to predict the properties of certain molecular graphs. And we introduced a shortest path prediction toy problem in order to get a grip of what our model was doing. And in this, we have multiple data sets with different statistics, and we randomly sample a shortest path, which the network's job is to predict. So I'm low on time, so I'll present these results really quickly. Basically, we found for the GraphMNIST problems, the spectral models outperformed the non-spectral models. The non-spectral model is shown in blue, and you can see its accuracy is lower than these other lines. This advantage persisted across various dropout conditions. This blue line is almost always at the bottom, and the spectral green and red models are always much higher. For the molecular classification problems, we found that our spectral models tended to perform really well early on in training. However, the non-spectral models eventually caught up. So basically, we don't get a benefit in overall performance, but we get this increase in efficiency, which is really nice and really consistent with this idea that these low frequency components should help with generalization and therefore efficiency. Finally, on our shortest path problems, these are random planar graphs that are constructed by randomly assigning points to the plane and then connecting them according to a Delaunay triangulation. We found that as we increased the number of nodes, there was an advantage to having spectral augmentation. This blue line is at the bottom. However, you need more than 32 nodes to start seeing that. However, we did not see this advantage persisting across data sets with different types of statistics, which we thought was kind of interesting. So for these Barabasi-Albert graphs, which are scale-free trees, you see no benefit at all because almost all the models hit ceiling almost immediately. You can barely see the line, it's right at 1. And for these community structured graphs, we actually find that as we increase the number of nodes, spectral augmentation does a lot of damage. This red line takes a really long time to get up to high performance. And we think that that's probably because the network starts introducing this over smoothing. It treats all nodes in the same cluster as the same. And this is something that's challenging for the network to unlearn. So it's using this hierarchical information in a really counterproductive way. So we think this type of analysis is useful for starting to unpack the benefits of spectral augmentation. We hope more generally this can give us a hint as to which types of graph data sets and graph problems stand to see efficiency improvements from coarse graining or hierarchy. Okay, I'm gonna skip to the end because I'm out of time. I just wanted to quickly mention that since this is a multidisciplinary AI and neuroscience conference, I would be derelict in my duties if I did not say that while I just looked at a couple of key cognitive functions Hippocampus is involved in, it's really involved in a ton of different cognitive functions that correspond to really big open problems in AI. And here are a couple of them. So if you're an AI researcher who's interested in getting neuroscientific inspiration for your research, I highly recommend checking out the Hippocampal research because it seems to be implicated in so many of these open problems that we care about. I found it particularly useful. I also want to thank my collaborators, particularly Dan McNamee, who did the spectral modulation work, as well as Matt Botvinnik and Sam Gershman. Also, Jonathan Goodwin and Peter Battaglia, who worked on the Spectral Graph Network with me, and Jesse, Neil, and Tim, who've been very useful for formulating a lot of my thoughts. Thank you very much. I'm happy to take any questions.
Right. Thank you very much, Kim. This was wonderful. There's a lot of machinery to unpack here. So we have a few questions here that are popping up that have been upvoted. So I'll read some to you here, and then we can discuss them a little bit. So the top one right now is, this is a question for Ayuno_N, and the question is, does this framework generalize to episodic memory in human hippocampus? So yeah,
that's a great question. So a big motivation, I sadly didn't talk about this enough, although I spent a lot of time wondering if I should try and squeeze episodic memory into my introduction. A big motivation for this is that we've known for a really long time that hippocampus seems to be involved in representing, in acquiring episodic memories. So basically, this is the fast acquisition of memories about a particular experience. And one reason that it's useful to move beyond the idea of just thinking about hippocampus for spatial navigation is that episodic memories are much more rich than simply your memories of how you navigated around a space. So the way I'm sort of thinking about this is that we want to understand and represent the statistics of how your experiences transition among each other. You want to generally know, what does it look like to move from one state to another across these experiences I've had, and use this as scaffolding for acquiring new memories really rapidly. I think being able to predict what types of things you generally expect to see are really useful for scaffolding what you actually saw in a specific instance in a particular episode that you experienced and then want to encode. So I guess definitely the answer is yes, this relates broadly to episodic memory, although we didn't really go over a specific linking function.
Cool, fascinating, thank you. All right, next question by Habilash. Are there any models that deal with non-Euclidean or Riemannian surfaces, right? So not exactly sure which situations that would happen, but I think that's does it generalize to other types of manifolds?
Yeah, so actually our work will definitely generalize to non-Euclidean environments. So graphs, for instance, are an example of a non-Euclidean environment, and other environments that are represented with Riemannian manifolds can also benefit from a similar approach. So whereas we used eigenvectors, the particular eigenvectors we use are really similar to these eigenvectors of a matrix called the graph Laplacian. There's a continuous version of this called the Laplace-Beltrami operator that applies to Riemannian manifolds. So its eigenfunctions, rather than eigenvectors, can be used to support basically the same types of processes that we talked about here. It's a nice language in general for talking about generalizations to non-Euclidean environments. And one of the reviews I posted, Michael Bronstein's review, is a really good summary of this approach and how it relates to both graphs and manifolds.
That's fascinating. Thank you. All right, I think we have time for one more question, maybe another one. So this is a question from Elif Muller. Thanks for the great talk. What does the cellular level architecture, as in layers, cell types of entorhinal cortex and hippocampal structures, tell us about how the representations you discussed are learned?
Oh, that's such a good and rich question. Okay, so I guess so I'll definitely caveat by saying there's a level of abstraction that we're talking about here that does not necessarily interface super specifically with the full anatomical level of detail that we know about these areas. They've been studied a whole lot. We know a lot about the circuitry and anatomy of these regions compared to other parts of the brain. I didn't get as low level as one could have. I would say one thing that is particularly relevant about the circuitry is the connections from between entorhinal cortex and hippocampus. They're connected in a loop with each other, so that you have information going from entorhinal cortex to hippocampus and then back again. Information comes into this area from the rest of the brain through entorhinal cortex. So we think entorhinal cortex is partly a useful bottleneck here. We also know a lot about which areas in cortex project to entorhinal cortex. So the dorsal sections get information from retrosplenial and visual areas, which seems to vary at a faster time scale, whereas more ventral areas get information from anterior cingulate and amygdala, which tend to vary at a slower time scale and capture more emotional information. I think it's probably time for me to stop answering this question, because I think you guys need to move on to the next talk. One of my favorite reviews ever is this review on the anatomy of the longitudinal axis by Strange et al. I highly recommend it, particularly for thinking about like multiscale representations and circuitry of hippocampus. There's a lot of other good ones as well.
That's lovely. Yes, thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us today. Unfortunately, yes, we are out of time, so we'll have to forego further questions. But thank you again, Kim, and then we'll pivot to the next session. So stay tuned, please.
Great. Thank you so much.